Thanks for listening to this archive of Ashbrook and Teaching American History's special webinar for Wednesday, March 17th, 2021. Today's program, If Men Were Angels, James Madison's Defense of the Constitution, consisted of a discussion between Dr. Jeff Sikkenga, Professor of Political Science at Ashland University, and Dr. Chris Burkett, also Professor of Political Science at Ashland University, about James Madison's ideas and actions as related to the drafting of the Constitution and its understanding and explanation over time.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jeff Sikkenga, Executive Director of the Ashbrook Center. Glad to have so many of you joining us today for this special webinar in honor of the birthday, the 270th birthday of James Madison. The title of our seminar today, our conversation, is If Men Were Angels, James Madison's Defense of the Constitution. Most of you, of course, I think know something about the Ashbrook Center, but for those who don't, we are an independent educational center located at Ashland University, and it's our mission to educate our fellow Americans, whether those are students, teachers, or citizens, in the history and founding principles of our country, and in the habits of reflection and choice, to borrow a phrase from the Federalist #1, that we think are necessary to perpetuate our republic. So we really take that educational mission seriously, and this webinar today is a part of that mission. And as an educational organization, as I've said many times, we believe fundamentally that education is not just about information, and it's certainly not about indoctrination, but it's about discovering the truth for yourself. We really operate on Aristotle's ancient maxim that all people by nature desire to know, but then we add, but they don't want to be told. They want to discover it for themselves. And we found that the best way to discover for yourself is to have a conversation with the past, great thinkers and minds like James Madison, with our teachers, with our students, and with each other. So we invite you to be part of that conversation today. I know this is going to be a topic that will engender a lot of commentary and questions. So please, through the Q&A function, send your questions. I'll try to get to as many of them as possible. Can't necessarily get to all of them, so I apologize ahead of time if we don't get to yours, but we'll certainly try. So thank you for participating with us in this conversation. And we really believe at Ashbrook that the conversation needs to be based on the primary historical documents and great texts of the American tradition. And of course, our text for today in many ways is the Constitution and the writings and thoughts of James Madison. And to help us with that conversation, we've invited Professor and Dr. Chris Burkett, who is joining us today. Chris is an old friend, of course. He and I have been together with the Ashland University and the Ashbrook Center from way back, too far, right? Too long ago.
Hard to count the years at this point.
It's been many. Chris received his bachelor's actually as a student here at Ashland University, and has a great and interesting story about that, and then went on to get his PhD from the University of Dallas at the Institute for Philosophic Studies. He did his dissertation on a very important and I think understudied aspect of America, which is American foreign policy during our founding. He is also editor of our well-known and well-received 50 Core Documents book from Ashbrook. So those of you who have that book, you get a chance to talk with the editor today who put that together. It's a wonderful resource for students, for teachers, and citizens. And we want to welcome those of you who are with us as citizens and supporters, but also, of course, our friends through Teaching American History, and also students in the Ashbrook Scholar Program and otherwise. Welcome all of you from around the country. I know many of you know Chris already. He's the director of our Ashbrook Scholar Program. He has been teaching in our teacher programs, Teaching American History, our seminars around the country for teachers. He's also been teaching in our Master of Arts in American History and Government program. And he's really done it all for Ashbrook. And we value that, and thank you for that, Chris. And of course, he actually got his start here at Ashland as a student of Peter Schramm. And many of you know Peter, but Chris, tell us about your encounter with Peter. It's always such a great and interesting story for, especially I think for students to hear.
Yeah, well, first of all, let me say thanks, Jeff, for the introduction, and I'm very proud to be a part of the great mission of Ashbrook. And I was fortunate enough to come back here and be part of Ashbrook and at Ashbrook University after having been an undergraduate student. So I was married and older at the time, and taking classes while working. But I was an art major. I was a history major, but I was also studying art. And I finally, my junior year, I think it was spring of my junior year, I by pure chance took a class with somebody I didn't know, Dr. Peter Schramm. And if I remember correctly, the very first day or within the first day or two of classes, I immediately knew that this was something different. The way he taught, the way he thought, thought out loud. This is what I wanted to do, if at all possible, with the rest of my life. And it became a goal of mine from that point forward to be able to teach and try to help others think through important things, just the way that Peter did for me. So he really opened my eyes. If people know Peter, you wouldn't be surprised that the very first day I met him, he insulted me. But that was that was in his own way, a way of showing kind of respect, right, for friendship. He often insulted his friends as a sign of his affection. So,
Oh, that's
but
great.
it was a very fortunate event that just by chance, almost, it seemed that I took a class with Peter. So.
That's wonderful. Yeah, we endeavor to keep Peter's spirit alive, and this idea, as you put it, of education as thinking and as conversation with the past. That really, Peter gave us that mind here at Ashbrook, and we so deeply appreciative of him and all of us who are in some way direct or indirect students of his. Chris also mentioned that he was an art major, and he's being modest. He's an artist. He actually has sold his artworks. Not all artists do that, and a very talented artist, and has a wonderful presentation. And we'll have him back sometime to do this on the art and architecture of liberty that he gives every summer to our Ashbrook Academy students, and people are in our Hilda Bretzloff Ashbrook Academy on America's Story. Just a wonderful presentation, and shows you how much politics and art have been connected in America ever since the founding. So again, maybe we'll have him back for that, but he's a Renaissance man, and glad to have you with us today.
Thank you very much.
So the 16th was yesterday, was James Madison's 270th birthday. We've been through this series of webinars this academic year. We've been going through the story of Land of the Free, from the time of America's founding on principles of freedom, all the way sort of through our historical struggle to live up to those principles. That's really been kind of the uniting theme for us. I thought we would have this conversation today about James Madison because we're in that part of our story where we start to see in the 20th century, especially, some attacks on the American Constitution. So I thought that fact, combined with the fact that it's Madison's birthday, to talk a little bit about Madison's understanding of the Constitution, his defense of the Constitution, and criticisms of the Constitution that we've heard then, and that perhaps we even hear today. So let me start with one that I've heard lately, which is James Madison does not deserve the title of Father of the Constitution. How do you respond to that? Tell us something about Madison before, during, and after the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and whether you think he deserves the title of Father of the Constitution.
That's a great question to start with. I'll actually give you James Madison's answer to that question. I think he would agree that I think he didn't want to be called that. He would not have wanted to be called that while he was alive anyway. In 1834, he actually wrote that the Constitution, and I'm quoting him here, the Constitution was not like the fabled goddess of wisdom, the offspring of a single brain, and it ought to be regarded as the work of many heads and many hands. So that was Madison's description of the birth of the Constitution. But personally, I think that if anybody deserves that title, it is Madison, not only because much of what's in the Constitution is there because he wrote it or proposed it at the convention in 1787, but also because he is very responsible, sort of behind the scenes, the politics behind the scenes. He's very responsible for the convention in 1787 happening. So can I back up for just a little bit? I want to go back up just a little bit and tell what I think is always kind of a funny story about Madison. He went to college at the College of New Jersey, which is now known as Princeton. And there's a great letter from Madison to his friend William Bradford of Philadelphia. After Madison gets home from college, I think it's 1771, he writes this letter. And he's writing to Bradford saying, oh, you're going to have all this success. And, Madison's sort of kicking around looking for something to do with his life. He tried studying law and he found that he didn't like it or wasn't very good at it. So he writes to his friend Bradford saying, yeah, I don't know what I'm going to do with myself. And I'm not sure if there's even a point. I mean, Madison was small. He had a kind of frail constitution, right? So he says, I'm not sure if it's even worth trying because, I'll probably won't, be on the earth for more than a few years. And the irony, of course, is, first of all, Madison outlives all of the other 54 delegates to the Constitutional Convention and dies at the age of 85 in 1836. So he lives much longer than he ever expected. But more importantly, he finally found the thing that his calling, the thing that he was really good at in politics during the Revolution. And he is elected to the Virginia legislature. There he plays an important role in drafting the language of religious liberty for the Virginia Declaration of Rights. He goes on to serve 2 3-year terms in the Confederation Congress in the 1780s. And while he's there, by the way, he learns firsthand of the deficiencies, the problems that are occurring as a result of the Articles of Confederation. And almost from the moment he's elected, he starts trying to amend the Articles and make them better. So from 1781 to 1787, he is thinking about and using his political skills to get people on board with the idea that we've got to fix these problems. So he came to be known as a very good politician. He built a great network of friends, many of whom he had met in college at New Jersey, and many of whom were on his side, and quite a few actually were there as delegates at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. So Madison really has a hand in bringing this convention about, which produces the Constitution. He's at the Annapolis Convention where he persuades the delegates to petition Congress to authorize a convention, right? So he is really a driving force that, again, eventually leads to the convention itself. And there, as we know, he takes a leading role in the debates. After the convention, he is really the leader in many ways of the Federalists, organizing the ratification effort. After ratification in the first Congress, Madison then goes on to propose the amendments that we know as the Bill of Rights. So the short answer is yes, if anybody deserves that title, it is James Madison.
So even by the time he's 30 years old, or not even 30, or thereabouts, he's already thinking about how do we create a more effective constitution for this country called America.
Yes, absolutely. And he has a kind of wisdom beyond his years. So he's found a way to apply the things that he was thinking about and studying even in college, right? But he has a kind of vision for what this union could be. Rather than being a union of 13 very loosely connected states, really held together by a treaty. I mean, the Articles is basically just a treaty between the states that's saying, they would sort of cooperate for certain purposes. Madison saw great potential in creating, again, what the Constitution calls a more perfect union. The great potential not just for the nation as a nation, but for the citizens who lived in that nation. There's something about creating this new union through this Constitution that would allow citizens to have more opportunities to enjoy that liberty and to pursue happiness that the Declaration of Independence talks about.
So Madison took his basic political principles and philosophy from the Declaration of Independence, or he shared that, what Jefferson called an American mind, from the Revolutionary period. And if you had asked James Madison, what are your basic political principles? Is it fair to say he would have pointed us to the Declaration of Independence and said, well, it's probably right there?
Yeah, I think absolutely that's true. And again, he was a supporter of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which he had a hand in, a small hand, but a hand in drafting some of the language. And I think the ideas are similar between the Virginia Declaration of Rights and the Declaration of Independence. The language is a little different, but Madison wholeheartedly supported that. He was a fervent revolutionary, by the way. A lot of people don't realize that before Madison was elected to the Virginia legislature, he was on the Orange County Committee of Public Safety, which was in charge of enforcing the boycott with the British with British trade, and he was apparently, by all accounts, very enthusiastic in his execution of those responsibilities. There may have been some, I don't know if there was tarring and feathering, but there were probably some riding the rails going on there. But anyway,
we don't often think of we always think of Madison as a careful, thoughtful, prudent. We don't always think of him as a man of revolutionary zeal.
He was, and again, his revolutionary zeal again was informed by his dedication to those fundamental principles as well.
So before, as you said, he has a great role in sort of getting people meeting at Mount Vernon for this in 1785 at George Washington's home, of course, and then from then on the next year at Annapolis, at what we call the Annapolis Convention. What's Madison's fundamental? Remind us of this, because I think it lays the groundwork for what he does in the convention, and then maybe his responses to criticisms of the Constitution afterwards. What's Madison's criticism? His fundamental criticisms of the Articles of Confederation? Why does he think they need to be replaced?
Yeah, that's a great question. He actually lays out in a document, writing, what he calls the vices of our political system under the Articles, and he lists a lot having to do with the inability of Congress to do its job. He lists a lot of things that the states are doing that they shouldn't be doing according to the Articles of Confederation. So there are these very practical considerations. But the big problem from Madison's perspective is that the big problem in this country under the Articles is the inability to prevent the states from engaging in factious laws that essentially, again, are written and driven and approved and enforced by the majority of citizens within the state, but that somehow fundamentally infringe upon or deprive others of their fundamental rights, those rights guaranteed by the Declaration of Independence. So Madison, again, part of his criticism of the Articles is we need to find a way to, allow the national government to do the things that it needs to do, but more importantly, we need to devise a political system that will make it less likely for people's rights to be violated by laws that are passed upon majority rule.
That's not something we often hear. We usually think of Madison's criticism of the Articles as we need a stronger, more effective national government. But you're saying it's both that and we need better state governments. We need state governments that aren't violating people's liberties. So it's both a stronger national government, but in many ways, safer, better state governments.
Yeah, so Madison's vision for a better constitution would be one that has things built into it that not only do the first thing you were mentioning, right, allow the various governments to do the things that they need to do and do them well, but they would somehow have the effect of mitigating what Madison called the mortal disease of popular governments, right? This tendency toward majority faction. So yeah, I mean, this is a primary concern of Madison's.
So how does Madison try to combat that fundamental problem of faction, which we know he talks about in Federalist number 10, for example, and he says, as you say, it's mortal disease of popular governments. Monarchies are brought down by revolutions, bad succeeding monarchs. But what kills republics is either big empires come and swallow them, or they're destroyed from within by factious fighting.
Right.
In the Constitutional Convention itself, how does Madison try to deal with that fundamental problem?
Yeah, well, this is where it gets really tricky because at the Constitutional Convention, there are people who are inclined, almost everybody, by the way, who goes, almost, not everybody who goes to the convention is inclined to make some changes to the Articles of Confederation. But there are some there who are inclined to not go too far because they really want to preserve the powers of the states and the importance of the states. And there are others like Madison who again say we need to be honest that there are problems within the states. Not again that Madison thinks the states aren't important, but that there are real problems within the states. So on June 6th, for example, at the convention, a very important day, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, who might be a close, I think, runner-up for father of the Constitution, but he's another story, stands up and makes the argument that people are happier in small states rather than large states. There's something about a state or a small state that makes people happier because they know their representatives and they feel safer and their rights are more secure and these sorts of things. And Madison says, aha, let me jump in here for a second. If people are happier in small states than large states, why is that the case? Well, because the larger the state, Madison argues, the easier the more likely it is for factions to form, majority factions to form. There's something about size of a state that matters in a way. But Madison then goes on and says, but where do we find these majority factions now? We find them in every state, right? Therefore, the problem is not the size of the state, but it's something about the states themselves. So Madison's proposal is that we need to start thinking about ways to enlarge our thinking about, from thinking simply on the state level to the national level. We enlarge the spheres, Madison says. If we start thinking about the union as us as individuals being part of a larger nation, a union, what we find is that interests are diversified, right? Opinions are diversified, and it makes it harder for a single majority to form, or a simple majority to form around a single idea or a single interest or this or that. And therefore, it will be less likely for factions to form on the national scale than they form in the states, which all by comparison are relatively small, right?
So we have at the convention this Madisonian approach of having an effective national government combined with kind of keeping the states in line and not violating rights. We've got other groups at the convention that are in favor of keeping the states basically as separate countries. And then we've got a group of people who are essentially in favor, people like Alexander Hamilton, of saying, why don't we just get rid of the states?
Right.
And Madison comes up with, or the sort of the Connecticut Compromise, which we all know, and that sort of gives us something like the structure that we have today. Right. But immediately after the convention and its work goes out to the states in September of 1787, we start to get criticisms of it. And we know from Madison's own writings that Madison wasn't completely happy with what came out of the convention. He really didn't, it's not like he just wrote everything and everybody said, yes, let's go with that. As he said, it was many hands and many minds, some of which prevailed over what he wanted. And so it's not a constitution that Madison loves 100%, but he's committed to defending it. But the criticisms start fast and furious almost right away. And I want to take you to one of the most important criticisms, sort of pre-Civil War criticisms that we really hear starting with the Anti-Federalists, which is this Constitution will destroy the states. We had the states as powerful, rightfully powerful entities under the Articles of Confederation. Now we've got a new Constitution. The Anti-Federalists say it will destroy the states. So reject this Constitution. That was a really powerful criticism that had a lot of traction with a lot of people who were in those days, especially, were very attached to their own states. How does Madison defend the Constitution against the charge that it's going to destroy the states?
Yeah, that's another great question. And you're absolutely right, by the way. The arguments of the Anti-Federalists, I think, are fascinating. They're very powerful. They should be taken seriously. And Madison does take them seriously. He actually takes the time to respond to these concerns very carefully and thoughtfully in the Anti-Federalists. He doesn't simply, or the Federalist Papers, sorry, he doesn't simply disregard them, right? Or discard them. So Madison's response to this is, look, what's the purpose of the Constitution is not to take all power away from the states, but to first of all acknowledge that they're, in terms of the balance of powers, the bulk of power resides with the states under the Articles. There are virtually no checks on the states. I mean, the Articles of Confederation say that the states shouldn't do this, can't do this, and Congress can do this, but there's no restraining power on the states. And there's nothing to check the states if they just want to ignore the article. So I think Madison's initial goal is not to shift all power from the states to the national government, but to bring some sort of balance here, in the sense that Madison thinks there are some things that the states should do, they're really good at. Again, like doing the things that affect us as citizens on sort of a day-to-day basis, the things that more immediately affect our rights and our liberties and our freedoms and our opportunities. But there are some things the national government is simply going to be better at doing, like handling international trade, or negotiating treaties, handling, foreign affairs and these sorts of things. Under the Articles of Confederation, the states were not supposed to be meddling in those things, but they were. The states were making their own treaties. They were negotiating trade agreements with other states and excluding other states. They were even raising their own armies and starting wars. Some states were declaring wars. And so I think what Madison's initial goal was, or his immediate goal was to leave the states with the power to do the things that the states are best suited to do, but create a national government that has the power to do the things it is best suited to do. And so the idea was, Madison says, to create sort of spheres of responsibility. Both are equally important, but in terms of different spheres or different responsibilities.
And it seems like that principle is established. You mentioned he wrote the Bill of Rights, and of course, one amendment, the 10th Amendment, which sometimes we perhaps have forgotten in America today, but this is Madison's words, and I just thought I'd read it because it's so apropos of what you're talking about. He says, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people." What
Right.
does that mean in Madison's mind? How does that help us understand the proper authority of the states?
Yeah, that's a really important amendment for Madison, because I think it reveals again that his intention was not to create this sort of leviathan, on the national level that would just continue to, take all power and interpret the Constitution, by the way, in such a way that would allow the national government to, continue to draw powers away from the states. That amendment is in there. I mean, Madison believed that 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 if the Constitution is put into action, it's adopted and ratified, and it works the way it was intended to work, there are these built-in checks and balances, right? Against, by the way, between the state governments and the national government that should not necessarily prohibit. There's not 100% guarantee for anything, according to Madison, right? But it should inhibit the ability or the tendency of the national government to draw unconstitutionally powers, from the states. But it was the Anti-Federalists, especially, that wanted the 10th Amendment as a sort of guarantee in writing that the Constitution should not be interpreted in such a way to allow the national government to, say we should be doing this, or the states can no longer do this. So Madison, by the way, included that, the Ninth Amendment, and many of the other amendments, as he put it, for the purposes of showing the Anti-Federalists that the Federalists, the supporters of the Constitution, really did not harbor any sort of secret malicious intentions in creating a national government and doing away with states. And it would have the added effect of making Anti-Federalists feel a little bit better about the new Constitution. It would win over, their allegiance to the new government and these sorts of things. But it reveals that Madison really did believe that the powers delegated through the Constitution to the national government are the powers in the Constitution. And that attempts to sort of create or invent powers through some magical interpretation of the Constitution should be looked at with great suspicion and caution. And as evidence, by the way, for this, just take the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798, right? Which Madison opposes very strongly and vehemently, and writes against as an example of the national government attempting to take away a power that, if it belongs to anybody, belongs to the states, Madison argued, right? Through some illegitimate interpretation of the powers of Congress.
Well, so we've got a number of questions that are already coming in, lots of them, Chris.
Okay.
One of them is, they're connected. Some of them are connected to this question of the proper role of the states, because one of the things that Madison was accused of by people like Alexander Hamilton is, hey, you changed your mind. At the Constitutional Convention, James Madison, you were a strong nationalist. Then you got under the spell of Thomas Jefferson, and you became a states' rights guy. And you changed your mind, and you gave up our original faith that we were going to have in creating a strong country and a strong union. But I know that at the end of Madison's life, there was a crisis over tariffs in South Carolina. And there was this question of whether a state can nullify or even secede. Madison is still alive. I think that happens right in 1830, 1831.
Yes.
And he's still alive, as you said, doesn't die till 1836. What's Madison's view on that question? How much power does he think the states really had?
Yeah, see, so it's interesting. When you look at the example of the Alien and Sedition Acts, Madison argued that's an unconstitutional attempt by the national government to exercise a power they don't have. When it comes to the claim that the states have the right to nullify and even secede from the Union, Madison argues that is also a claim of an unconstitutional power. So he makes this very clear in a series of letters, maybe the most famous of which is to Daniel Webster, where Madison argues that, look, there is no power of the states to veto or nullify an act of Congress. They can oppose it in various other legal means, right? They can slow it down, or they can try to change the law. The elections can affect these things, but there is no state right to veto an act of Congress. And there is definitely, Madison says, no right to secede from the Union. So what this suggests to me, Jeff, is, on Hamilton's claim that Madison is a flip-flopper or something like this, I see Madison as being very consistent. He has a certain understanding of what the constitutional powers of the states are and what the constitutional powers of the national government are. And he's very consistent in saying, within this, framework of the Constitution, this is unconstitutional or that's unconstitutional on either side.
So in some respects, we are one country under one government, things like national defense and foreign policy, and we wear our American hat and we're American citizens first. But on some things that aren't delegated to the national government, the country really is a bunch of distinct political societies who do things their own way.
Yeah.
So, today, speed limits or whatever it happened to be, that would be left and reserved to the states. And
Yeah.
Wyoming is going to be really different from Rhode Island. And
Right.
Madison would be okay with that?
Yeah. Back then, one of the important things that was left to the states had to do with questions of religion, for example, right? I mean, Madison was a big supporter of religious liberty, but the fact is, questions of having to do with religion, should people, have to attend church, any of these kinds of questions, those were left to the states. I mean, Madison had his own views on that, but again, he acknowledged that these are questions that ought to be left to the states, or are going to be left to the states under this Constitution.
So people are giving questions now, asking you, put yourself in James Madison's mind. One question wants to know, has that changed with the 17th Amendment and the direct election of senators, for example?
Yeah.
Has Madison's vision for the role of the proper role of the states in this balance with the federal government, has it shifted, and has that been essentially undermined or destroyed? What would Madison think?
Yeah, great question. It's shifted for sure. So I think there's an undeniable tendency, especially in the late 1800s, but especially in the 20th century, to shift power toward more and more power toward the national government. Now, but what causes it? So, by the way, I've heard people say, well, this kind of proves the Anti-Federalists were right. I don't necessarily agree with that. What caused this shift, this tendency to shift toward greater national power? Well, first, I think a lot of it has to do with the Reconstruction policies of Congress in the aftermath of the Civil War, right? So the circumstances after the Civil War invite a much more vigorous and energetic national government, at least in the Reconstruction policies that come out of that age. But the real shift comes with progressives. And I'm thinking of progressives like Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt, who affected this shift not only by enhancing the important role that the president plays in our political system, but also by calling for and establishing a national, administrative regulatory system. This is really the vision of Woodrow Wilson. He affects a lot of this in World War I, but it's really Franklin Roosevelt that brings this into being. So, I think James Madison's response to this would be, again, progressives affected this shift toward national supremacy really specifically by disregarding the limitations of national power built into the Constitution. One other thing I'll just throw out very quickly, another thing that has allowed for this shift toward national power and the erosion in the minds of some of the importance of the states is this notion of the living Constitution, right? Which says, the Constitution is a living document and we need to interpret it more broadly in order to meet the needs of our day. I think James Madison would say, living Constitution, that's just a fancy way for saying that the Constitution really doesn't matter and that what it means is what we say it means, right? So I think Madison would say there's a lot that happens in the 20th century that is a result really of either interpreting the Constitution in a very different way or broad way than Madison would have thought possible, or simply by saying the Constitution, what the Constitution actually says doesn't really matter that much.
Let me take up that then, because the second group that was obviously, as you mentioned already, very critical of Madison's Constitution were the early 20th century progressives, people like Woodrow Wilson, who was openly critical of the Madisonian Constitution. The argument for a lot of those folks in the early 20th century is, look, the Constitution might have been okay when Madison put all this together and the founders put this together in the 18th century, but come on, it's the 20th century now. It's outdated, it's anti-democratic, and it's elitist. Those are criticisms. We still hear some of those today, but we really heard those very powerfully in the early 20th century. I think of the election of 1912, when practically every candidate running is like Teddy Roosevelt is arguing these things. Right. What do you think Madison's response to that criticism, that the Constitution is out of date, elitist, and anti-democratic?
Yeah, again, another great question. Well, first of all, progressives are right when they say that circumstances have changed, right? I mean, it's true that the world of 1900 is much different than the world of 1800. But I think Madison would reply, first of all, by pointing out that there is a way built into the Constitution that allows us to change the Constitution, right, through the amendment process. There is a democratic process built into the Constitution to amend it if we feel that we need to. Now, progressives would respond to that by saying, well, look, yeah, that's there, but the amendment process is much too complicated. It's tedious, it's slow, it's very difficult to accomplish, right? I think Madison's response to that response would be, yes, but that's intentional, because when you're talking about changing the fundamental law of your land in the Constitution, right? You want to be careful about making those changes. You want those changes to be done very deliberately, intentionally. It should be a slow process, because if you're not careful and you get carried away by passionate interests of the day, or this or that, it's very possible that in trying to make the Constitution better, you actually make it worse, and it could have unforeseen consequences.
And so would Madison look at something like the Prohibition Amendment as an example of popular passion and sentiment sort of running away from itself, putting it into the Constitution? Seemed like a good idea in 1919 and 1920, and then 13 years later, America says, what were we doing?
Yeah, right. So there's, by the way, this is an example of, as Madison wrote in the Federalist Papers, this is the equivalent of the people of Athens, condemning Socrates to drink the hemlock on one day, and then the next day erecting statues in his honor, right? They regret it. By the way, I think Madison would just generally have been opposed to Prohibition, because he was, despite his 5'4" stature, he drank a pint of whiskey a day, apparently, because you couldn't drink the water back then. But I just mentioned that in passing. But yes, the process of amending, it can be amended, and Madison was open to that, right? But he himself introduced a number of amendments in the first Congress to the Constitution. But again, this should be done deliberately, based on reason, and not in such a way that we get carried away with our passions, because we can often regret those things if we're not careful. So yeah, again, you mentioned that the progressives argued not only is the Constitution out of date, but it's undemocratic. Now that's an interesting one, because I think Madison would, in a certain sense, reply, Yeah, that's partly true. It is not simply democratic, or it's not purely democratic, right? By the way, progressives were making this argument by pointing out that, look, there's only one democratic branch of the government. That's the House of Representatives, right? At least before the Senate changes. All other officers in government are only elected indirectly, right? The Senate through the state legislatures, the president through the Electoral College, federal judges through the nomination and confirmation process. So it's not really that democratic. And Madison's response is, you're partly right. You're mostly right. It's not democratic. It is Republican. That is, it's a Republican constitution that rests on a democratic basis. So he would say, by the way, all power in government originates from the people, right? But it goes through this series of what Madison called filtrations through these various ways in which people are elected. And the purpose again of this was to allow any of the sort of passions, the fiery passions that might get worked up, to be sort of filtered out, right? In order to, as Madison put it, refine and enlarge the public views. So again, it's got a democratic base, but it's a more Republican mode of electing people and getting things done. And again, the purpose for Madison is just to make sure that we filter out those passions, many of which, by the way, those are the passions are the things that lead to factions, right? That we were talking about earlier. And in the end, make decisions based as much on what's reasonable as possible. So.
And what about the argument that we heard among progressives, people like Charles Beard, the famous scholar, and it was a very common argument, again, around the election of 1912, it reached a high point. The Constitution was created to protect the entrenched interests of property and the rich.
Yeah, right.
What would Madison's response to that be?
Yeah, again, Charles Beard's famous book, The Economic Origins of the Constitution, I think came out in 1913. Beard was essentially a progressive historian who tended to view things through a kind of Marxist lens. That is, we had to think about history from the perspective of class distinctions, especially economic class distinctions. And he argued that the framers were intended to design a system that would favor the wealthy, including themselves. My first response, by the way, to that is, if that was their intent, they did a pretty poor job of it, because almost all of the framers died broke. So I shouldn't laugh at things like that, but they did not have money when they died. Some of them even went to jail, right? Debtors jail. But when Beard and others cite this or make this claim, they often cite things that James Madison said. For example, Madison claiming, again in Federalist number 10, which we've mentioned before, that one of the most fundamental jobs of government is to protect property. And progressives interpreted this to mean, well, that's just another way of saying protecting the wealthy, right? Keeping the rich rich and keeping the poor poor. But what they miss is Madison's argument that what he's actually arguing is that government should protect not only different degrees of property, but different kinds of property, he says. And I think what he means by that is the reason government should protect not just differences of wealth, but it should protect or promote the conditions that allow people to pursue wealth in different ways according to their talents, right? Again, people by nature have different talents. They're suited to do different things. Some are, by nature suited to be mechanics. Some are better suited to be college professors or artists.
Some like yourself are artists, and I can't.
Yeah, right.
Be a guy.
I didn't make that much money off my paintings, though. It wasn't much. So, and some are suited to be entrepreneurial, to start businesses, and all these sorts of things, right? So when Madison says government should protect property, he's not just talking about protecting differences in wealth. He's actually saying it should create opportunities for people to pursue and acquire property. And again, not even just for the sake of the property, but because for most people, property is required. The pursuit of some kind of property or wealth is necessary for us to do the things that allow us to pursue happiness, right? So I think Madison's protection of property is much broader than the progressives give him credit for here. if that makes sense. I hope I was being clear.
It means that he understands property as a personal right of everybody to go out and acquire it, make a living, own the fruits of your own labor, whether you're rich, middle class, or poor.
Yeah. By the way, can I just say on this point, this is a great point, Jeff. You know, we were talking earlier about Madison's vision for the Union. One of the things I think he's making a more perfect Union through this new Constitution, Madison saw the potential to create what you might call the world's largest free trade zone, right, between the states. And and just think of the opportunities that would arise for more and more Americans if that were the case, right? The opportunities for trade and commerce and partnership and entrepreneurship between the states and among the states, right? If this new Constitution is established and can promote that kind of opportunity for people, more and more people will be able to participate in property and enjoy that fundamental individual right, as you were saying, right?
So one question that we've got coming in is asking about Madison's view on voting and who should have the right to vote, because one of the arguments, as you know, from the progressives is the Constitution was anti-democratic and did not immediately extend the franchise to everybody. What was Madison's view on who should have the right to vote? Was he in favor of restricted suffrage or broader suffrage?
That is a fantastic question. Madison was actually quite liberal in a certain sense when it came to enlarging the franchise, at least among males at the time, right? Women voting is another issue, but which we can also discuss if you like. But when it came to males, Madison was in favor of reduce. By the way, in 1776, every state, in fact, in 1788, when the Constitution was ratified, every state had property requirements for people to hold office and vote. In Virginia, Madison was in favor of reducing, and in fact, I think in one house, doing away with any kind of property requirements. That would essentially open the franchise up entirely to all, again, males of a certain age, who, regardless of the property, you know, their wealth, right? So he was actually quite liberal in that sense. The irony here is, if I can just it's related, I think somehow, the claim of progressives that Madison and the framers were not, you know, pro-democracy, that they were not democratic enough. There's an irony in this, because it's actually Woodrow Wilson who makes that claim very specifically, right? Madison and the framers did not try to set up a democratic system. Well, the irony is Woodrow Wilson was not that much in favor of democracy either. A lot of people may not know this, but you know, Theodore Roosevelt, for example, was saying, we need to give people more opportunities to be involved in politics, give them the power of recall, referendum, initiative, direct primary, and all this stuff. Woodrow Wilson says, no, none of that. We don't want any of that. We want to reduce the number of things that the people do when it comes to democracy. Why? Because Woodrow Wilson understood that that democracy, too much democracy can hinder the ability of the great leader, the enlightened leader in the form of the president, to do the things he thinks are best. So when the progressives, by the way, when progressives like Woodrow Wilson say that the Constitution is too undemocratic, what they really mean is that the Constitution is too complicated, separation of powers, checks and balances, and all these things. They stand in the way of the president from doing the things that he thinks is best for the nation, right? All of these things built into the Constitution they tie the hands of the president, and therefore it's undemocratic. But again, I think there's a great irony here in the accusation of Wilson of Madison not being democratic enough.
Right. Recent criticisms, sort of, some of them come out of the early 20th century progressive movement. But one recent criticisms that we hear a lot of today, and I want to get your take on Madison's response to this: the Constitution is a racist, sexist document. The Constitution was a pro-slavery document. It didn't extend the franchise to people of color, women, etc., and therefore it was racist and sexist. what's Madison's view on, for example, the relationship between slavery and the Constitution?
Yeah, another great question. So I'll just point out a few facts, okay, so that as people think about this for themselves, they can be armed with some important information here. It's important to remember, first of all, that the Constitution does not prohibit anybody from voting. It does not prohibit women from voting, for example, right? Who votes is left to the states, as we know. By the way, students are often taught that women were not allowed to vote until 1869, when Wyoming gave women the franchise. That's not true. Women voted in New Jersey, for example, until the early 1800s, when the right was taken away by the majority party because women tended to vote for the other party, but that's a political reason. The Constitution does not prohibit anybody from voting based on race. Again, this is left to the states to decide. But interestingly enough, there were Black Americans voting in northern states in the late, after 1776, and many of them voted on ratification. So I just want to throw out a few facts here, right? So, but the primary reason, again, as you point out, that the Constitution is called racist is because I think it's primarily because it did not abolish slavery immediately. The founders made some compromises on this, right? The framers made compromises and allowed slavery to continue. By the way, this is actually not a new argument. This is an argument that abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison made back in the 1830s and 40s and 50s even. So, but again, just some facts. One of the criticisms of the Constitution is that the importation of slaves was allowed to continue until 1808, right? But we have to remember, I think, that under the Articles of Confederation, Congress had no power to ever end the importation of slaves. At the Constitutional Convention, the delegates debated this. Some of them insisted that the importation of slaves should be abolished immediately upon ratification, because, as one delegate said, slavery is inconsistent with the principles of the Revolution. Now, you have certain delegates from North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia in particular, who said that they would leave the convention if Congress was ever given any power to regulate the importation of slaves. So James Madison, who had initially supported immediate abolition, by the way, of the importation of slaves, realized that some compromise was necessary. He was willing to say 1800 instead of 1808. But in the end, we know what happened, right? It ends up being 1808. And Madison opposed this. Madison said at the convention, in opposition to 1808, all the mischief in the world can be done in 20 years. That was a very insightful prediction on Madison's part, right? So he was opposed to that compromise. So was it a compromise? Yes. Was it a step in the right direction? Madison doesn't think it is, interestingly enough. Others later, like Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, would say this was a step in the right direction. Okay, but Madison himself did not think that this was a good compromise.
Now that's really interesting, because great fact, because in Federalist 42, I think it is, in public, Madison defends the importation clause as saying it's a great step in favor of humanity, that eventually the slave trade can be abolished. It's interesting that privately at the convention, he said something different.
Yeah, that's right.
That's because he has to defend the Constitution and try and win over people who don't like slavery in the state of New York and want to see it gotten rid of immediately. And he says, well, yes, it's not as good as if it was abolished immediately, the slave trade, but it can be eventually.
Yeah, again, a great point. So, by the way, it's important to remember too that Madison's Madison's record of the debates was kept private until his death, right? At which point nobody was able to read these until after his death, and Madison did that intentionally, protect, to encourage the at the time of the convention, encourage people to speak freely without fear of retaliation or punishment of some sort, right? Political punishment. But yeah, Madison had to defend it. Now, by the way, on the other clause of the Constitution that's problematic, the 3/5 clause, Jeff, on your point, when Madison it falls on Madison to defend the 3/5 clause in the Federalist Papers. And in the original edition that he published, he does not defend it in his own words. He quotes, as he says, the argument of one of our fellow Southern brethren or something like that, right? So what he does in quotation marks is he gives an explanation and a defense of the 3/5 clause, but in the words of a Southern gentleman, right? He won't even defend it in his own words. So.
Because Madison thinks that the Constitution is set up, and he does note that, for example, the word slave or slavery is never used in the Constitution. Right. So that, as Frederick Douglass points out later, you could abolish slavery in all of the states and never have to change the Constitution.
That's true.
Or the Congress could abolish the interstate commerce in slaves, for example, and never have to change the Constitution. Yeah. And as you said, Lincoln, for example, looks back to people like Madison for inspiration for that kind of thinking.
I think Madison was very helpful. Just on that point, I'll be quick. Yeah. Madison was very helpful. Look, get the Constitution passed, and even with some compromises, there is still the hope and the possibility that even with the compromises, slavery will be curtailed, that it can eventually die out, right? Over time in the future. So I think he was actually very hopeful that would happen.
So we've got so many questions.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm talking to you.
No. They're just so, it's great to hear. And you're every time you talk, we're getting more questions in, which is great. But let me ask you this one. Someone asked about Madison's relationship with Washington. And I just thought, in the moments we have left, where does Madison rank among the founders?
Yeah, well, this is a great point. Boy, by what criteria do you judge? Look, that's such a tough question. Look, if you want to look to the founder who is most important in terms of laying out the fundamental ideas or principles, right? That's Jefferson. When you look to the example among the founders of what good statesmanship looks like, that's clearly Washington, right? What good judgment looks like. With Madison, it's a kind of it's not simply knowledge. There's a kind of wisdom on Madison's part. That is, he has this kind of vision of what a constitution should be. There has never been a constitution of its sort ever in existence. So for him to be able to think about what a constitution should be like and how it should work, and also, by the way, therefore, articulate the principles that ought to animate a constitution and a government, and think about, by the way, with such great insight into the fact that a constitution has to be built around what human beings are like. You can create a perfect constitution, but only if men are angels, right? So, but men aren't angels. So you have to frame a constitution with a very sober understanding that human beings can be good, but they can be bad too, right? They can be ambitious. They can be all these things. So Madison, I think, is among the top three for sure in my book, because he brings one of these other important pieces, right? Jefferson, fundamental principles; Washington, statesman-like leadership; Madison helps Americans think. Let me put it this way: he helps Americans know that they have a constitutional mind.
That's a great way to put it. Thank you, Chris, for taking the time to join us. As I said, so many questions. I'm sure Chris would be happy to take your questions if you want to send them to him. Sure. We've got a lot of them from teachers who are joining us, from students and others around the country. So please send them to Chris. You can find his email address online, and he'll be, I'm sure, happy to respond. Thank you for joining us, everyone. What a great, really interesting, lively conversation. It's a way for us to take a moment to honor one of America's truly great founders, whether top 1, 2, or 3, one of the best for sure. And a way for us to kind of have a conversation that helps us to rethink about America's fundamental principles and ultimately, of course, what it means to be an American by looking at a great American, James Madison. We'll be sent a recording of this webinar so that you can listen again and go back through it, distribute it to your friends, to your family, to your students. We'd be delighted to have as many people as possible have that conversation with Mr. Madison, try to enter his mind and think the thoughts that he thought and understand the arguments he made in defense of this Constitution, which Frederick Douglass called our glorious liberty document. Thank you for joining us today. We appreciate it. If you want to know more about Ashbrook, of course, look us up at ashbrook.org. For our teachers and students out there, Teaching American History, TAH.org, wonderful resource for primary documents and great texts of the kind we were talking about today. Thank you very much for joining us. As always, stay healthy, stay hopeful, and stay connected with Ashbrook. Thank you.
Thanks again for listening. You can learn more about our free programs, resources, and our documents collection for teachers, students, and citizens at Teaching American History or TAH.org.